Welcome to part 4 of our series on the 8 parts of speech, in which we tackle the verb. So I've got a fun little warm-up for us. In just 30 seconds, I want you to see how many verbs you can list. They don't have to be amazing verbs. They can be really simple ones. We're going for quantity over quality. And I've got a little timer up here on the screen to track your time. So I will announce when your time is up. On your mark, get set, and go. Time's about half up. All right, time's up. So let's see, how many verbs did you get? Well, this was my attempt. I came up with run, jump, climb, eat, sleep, fetch, dance, waddle, laugh, smile, talk, chat, fear, and joy. So what is a verb? A verb is a word that tells an action, either mental or physical, an occurrence, or a state of being. So a verb's role within a sentence is to tell us what the subject of the sentence is doing. Every complete sentence must contain at least one verb. So if you don't have a verb, it's not a complete sentence. There are 3 types of verbs that you should be aware of. So first is the action verb. An action verb expresses an action that a person, animal, object, or process in nature can do. Usually, an action verb is the main verb of the sentence. And action verbs tend to be the easiest ones to find in a sentence. They're words like drink, run, exfoliate. Second type of verb is a linking verb. A linking verb provides a connection or link between the subject of the sentence and a noun or an adjective that describes or identifies that subject. So sometimes a linking verb can serve as the main verb in a sentence. Sometimes, not always. A linking verb allows the writer to add some descriptive details throughout the sentence. Your third type is an auxiliary verb. An auxiliary verb helps other verbs by adding tense, mood, voice, or modality. Modality is possibility, ability, permission, advice. So for example, a word like may or must. Now, the thing about auxiliary verbs is that they cannot exist by themselves in a sentence. An auxiliary verb always has to be connected to another verb. It's basically helping another verb do its job, which is why auxiliary verbs are also known as helping verbs. So let's look at some examples of each. So these are examples of action verbs. Write, read, run, jump, walk, kiss, play, wonder, wander, imagine, fear, enjoy, admire, speak, meander, consider, think, try, enable, empower, devour, respond, suffer, skedaddle, whimper, cook, applaud. There's tons of action verbs. These are just a very small sampling. And action verbs, remember, are often the easiest ones to find in a sentence. Linking verbs. Here's a bunch of examples of linking verbs. Be, become, been, appear, remain, feel, look, smell, sound, taste, stay, grow, turn, prove, have, had, has, do, did, does, will, would. So these are all linking verbs. And lastly, let's look at auxiliary or helping verbs. Am, is, are, was, were, be, being, been, have, has, had, do, does, did, will, would, shall, should, may, might, must, can, could, ought. Now, some of these can also be linking verbs. So you can't just memorize lists of verbs in order to identify which is which. You have to look at what it's doing in the sentence. Some rules that you need to follow for action verbs. Action verbs must describe an action, not a state of being. So a word like taste can be an action verb, but it can also be a linking verb. You have to look at what it's doing in the sentence. If taste is an action, you are performing the action of tasting something, then that would be an action verb. But if taste is describing a state of being, that this cookie tastes like blah, 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 then that is not an action verb. Action verbs and linking verbs can be used together, but they have to be in separate clauses, in separate pieces of the sentence. They can't be one after the other. And action verbs can be paired with auxiliary verbs, and they can be right together. So let's look at a couple sentences that have action verbs. Both sentences that I'm going to give you have action verbs. See if you can identify the verbs. So our first sentence, Lindsay rode her bike to the library today. So where is the action in that sentence? What did she do? She rode. She rode her bike. So rode is your action verb. Your next sentence, Dean and Joseph argued about their work project. All right, what did they do? They argued. Argued is your action verb. You see how easy action verbs are? All you have to do is just look at the subject of the sentence. Okay, what'd they do? Now here's the difference between action verbs and linking verbs. Don't mix them up. An action verb can be the main verb of a sentence, usually. A linking verb can be the main verb of a sentence, sometimes. Action verb is more common than a linking verb as the main verb. An action verb can show action. That's why it's called an action verb. A linking verb cannot show action. It can only show a state of being or a condition. So let's talk linking verbs. Two sentences I'm going to give you. I want you to identify the linking verb in each sentence. Then try to identify what two things each of these verbs is linking. So here's our first sentence. I am sick of all this barking. So remember, we're not looking for an action. We're looking for a linking verb, which typically shows a state of being, and it connects two things. So our verb is am. That's our linking verb. Now, what two things is this verb linking? This verb is linking I, the subject, with sick, saying I am sick of this. Am connects I with the adjective sick. All right, here's our next one. Phil has way too much paperwork. So what is our linking verb? It is has. What is this linking verb linking? What two things? One of them is going to be the subject. Subject of our sentence is Phil. Phil has what? Paperwork. Way too much is describing his paperwork. So has is connecting Phil with the noun paperwork. Let's look at a sentence that has two types of verbs in it, action and linking. Andrea was frustrated by her husband Ben hogging the Nintendo Switch all the time, so she finally bought her own. So let's find our two verbs, was and bought. Now, that word frustrated might have tricked you because it's got an ed, and maybe you thought that would mean it's a verb, but frustrated is actually describing what Andrea was. It's not a verb. So we've got an action and a linking verb, which is which. I just gave you a big hint. Was is our linking verb because was is not showing any action. The action is coming from bought. So that's our action verb. So let's look at what job each of these verbs is performing in the sentence. What does was do? Was is a linking verb, so it has to be linking two things. What does it link? It links Andrea to frustrated. It tells us that Andrea was frustrated. Now, what does bought do? Bought tells us what Andrea did. It tells us what her action was. Does that make sense? Now let's turn our attention to auxiliary and action verbs. So both sentences below have auxiliary verbs and action verbs. I want you to see if you can find both of them and identify which is which. So here is our first sentence. She could not decide where to go out for dinner, much to the annoyance of her boyfriend. Let's try to find our action verb first. So what did she do? Or in this case, not do. Decide. Decide is our action. Now, where is our auxiliary verb? Our auxiliary verb is could. There's our auxiliary, there's our action. Now, let me show you something. If I take out the word decide, our sentence becomes, she could not where to go out for dinner, much to the annoyance of her boyfriend. You notice how that sentence makes no sense whatsoever? It's not proper English. The sentence has no meaning. That's because an auxiliary verb cannot be the only verb in a sentence. It's not strong enough to hold the sentence together. It's just a helpful little guy that helps out another verb. Think of it that way. All right, here is our other sentence. Chinstrap penguins will only sleep for 4 seconds at a time while their chicks are young. Fun fact, this is actually true. So where is our verb, our action verb? Something that the penguin is doing. Sleep. Sleep's our action verb. So where is our auxiliary verb? Usually you look 1 or 2 words behind your action verb and you'll find it. Will. So our action and our auxiliary. Now here again, look at what happens if I take out sleep. Chinstrap penguins will only for 4 seconds at a time while their chicks are young. It doesn't make sense. So that's another way that you know that that's an auxiliary verb and not a linking verb, because the sentence doesn't make sense now. So the differences between auxiliary verbs and linking verbs. These can be tricky for students because some of the same words can be used. Like has and have, those can be auxiliary verbs, but they can also be linking verbs. Again, you have to look at the job it's doing inside the sentence. You can't just memorize a list of words. So an auxiliary verb can never, 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 never be the main verb of the sentence. Impossible. You don't have a sentence. It will not make sense. A linking verb can be the main verb of the sentence sometimes, because it's more common for an action verb to be the main verb. An auxiliary verb cannot stand alone. There always has to be another verb after the auxiliary verb. It can't just be on its own. It can have other words in between it and the other verb. A linking verb can stand alone. It does not need another verb to help it out. An auxiliary verb cannot show action, and neither can a linking verb. An auxiliary verb must be attached to another verb. A linking verb must connect a noun or adjective to the subject of the sentence. So you see how each of the three types of verbs has a very distinct job that it needs to do within the sentence. So, how can you figure out if it's a linking verb or an auxiliary verb? Think back, because I've given you this answer already. What do? You look at what the verb is doing in the sentence. So if it's helping an action verb, it's an auxiliary verb. And remember, in order to help, it needs to be right there with the other verb, within just a few words of the other verb. They have to stay close together in the sentence. Think of an auxiliary verb as being a very, very lonely little verb. It's got to have its friend nearby. If it is connecting a noun or adjective to the subject, it's a linking verb. So if you look at the verb and you see a noun right after it that it's linking to the subject, or if you see an adjective right after it that it's linking to the subject, it's a linking verb. If there is only one verb in the sentence and it isn't an action verb, then by default, it must be a linking verb, because remember, auxiliary verbs cannot stand alone. They're lonely, weak little verbs that need their buddy. All right, let's get some more practice in. Auxiliary and linking verbs. We're going to look at two sentences. Can you determine which verbs are linking and which are auxiliary? Now, you may also see some action verbs in the sentence. Be aware, I could try to trick you. She was glad that she was wearing her seatbelt when the car accident happened. Got a couple of verbs going on here. Got another one there. Got another one there. So let's identify what types of verbs. Well, wearing is an action, right? Something that she was doing. Happened, that's an action. So we're left with these two was's. Let's start with that second was, because that second was is sitting right there next to a verb. Look at that. It's connected to this other verb. It's its buddy. So what type of verb is that? That is an auxiliary verb. Let's look at the other verb. What's it doing in the sentence? Was. She was what? She was glad. So this verb is linking she to glad. Therefore, it is a linking verb. Yuri was delighted to find an adorable coffee shop right down the street from her hotel. All right, so where's our verb? We are dealing with another was. What is this was doing in the sentence? We don't have another verb right by it. Now, you might have gotten fooled by find, but next to find is the word to, T-O. So to find is what's called an infinitive. I'll explain about infinitives in another lesson. They don't count as verbs. It's a verb, a word that's normally a verb, but it's behaving in a different way in the sentence. So the only verb we have to worry about in this sentence is was, which means single verb, so it cannot be an auxiliary verb. But we can also look at what it's doing. It is connecting or linking Yuri and delighted, so it's a linking verb. Remember, an auxiliary verb can never be the only verb in a sentence. I keep repeating that. It's like it's important or something. All right, are you ready for a challenge? We're going to tackle a sentence that has all three types of verbs. So the first thing you're going to need to do is find them all. When April and Gabriel watched The Mummy at the Dollar Theater, April thought she might be too scared by the movie, but Gabriel assured her that the movie was honestly more funny than scary. So let's find our verbs. Watched, thought, might be, assured, and was. So now that we've found the verbs, let's identify which type each one is. First, the action verbs. So which verbs are causing action to happen? Someone's doing something. That first one, watched, that's an action verb. Thought, that's an action. Because remember, it can be a mental process or a physical process. And assured. Assured is another action verb. Now let's find the linking verbs. Be is a linking verb. And was is a linking verb. And that leaves the auxiliary verb might. So that might have been a confusing sentence for you. Let's look at what job each verb performed in that sentence and see if that helps you understand it better. If you did understand it and you got all them right, great job. So what is watched doing? Watched tells us what April and Gabriel did. Thought tells us what April did. Might helps the reader understand that April was not actually scared right then, but there was the possibility she could be scared later. So that is what an auxiliary verb does, remember? It can show something that's conditional, that's not actually true right now. Be is linking April to too scared. And it might have tricked you because you had two verbs right next to each other and they happen to be an auxiliary verb and an linking verb. Assured tells us what Gabriel did. And then was links movie to honestly more funny than scary. Let's review. So I'm going to give you a sentence, and each sentence is going to have a highlighted word. I want you to identify whether the highlighted verb in each sentence is an action verb, a linking verb, or an auxiliary verb. Here's our first one. Did you remember to feed the dog yesterday, Brian? Is did an action, linking, or auxiliary? It is auxiliary. It is helping out the word remember. Next sentence. The baby otter squeaked anxiously for his mother as he wandered the enclosure. So what type of verb is squeaked? It is an action. It's what the baby otter is doing. He will bake a red velvet cake tomorrow for his mom's birthday party. So what is will doing in this sentence? Well, if you look at it, it is right behind an action verb, bake, so it's an auxiliary verb. From the time we could walk, Laura was my very best friend. What is was? In this sentence, it is being a linking verb. It's linking Laura to best friend. Our last one, the girl walking down the street had red hair tucked under a wide-brimmed straw hat. What is had? Had is a linking verb because it's linking the girl to red hair. All right, so that concludes our lesson on verbs. In the next lesson, part 5 of the parts of speech, we will be looking at adjectives and adverbs.